begin with a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was actually created by the students who took the PCC communications course in the fall. As we begin our gathering, we respectfully acknowledge that our event today is taking place on occupied Coast Salish land and that the University of Washington is on the homelands of the Duwamish people. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who live and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and the water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. So this week we're talking about food and other social inequities that Jennifer will be talking to us about. Dr. Jennifer Otten is an associate professor in environmental and occupational health sciences and faculty researcher in the UW Center for Public Health Nutrition. She also serves as the food systems director and core faculty in the nutritional sciences program and as co-director of Livable City Year. And if you Google here, you see she's done some important work on mapping risk factors, social, economical risk factors in King County by zip code, which is super interesting. So she may get a chance to talk with us about that. So take it away, Jennifer. Let's hear about food security. After
Great.
We all talked about food at the beginning.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to get to meet another group of students from different programs. So I'm really looking forward to the types of questions you'll be asking. One of the things I envisioned was, I know what David talks about, and he talks about climate change and food production and what kinds of crops will be affected and how they'll be affected by things like temperature and precipitation and biodiversity and pests as the climate changes. So I had envisioned he would give that first, and he may indeed show up and then give the second. And so I sort of created a talk that was really thinking about COVID as a case study for what happens when the food supply chain gets disrupted, and what we can learn from it to kind of think about climate change. And so you can kind of like think about it. And this is my son, my third grader, saying goodbye. So, lots of caregiving responsibilities going on around here. Anyway, so that's how I had kind of envisioned it. But if after I give my talk, if we do still want to talk about climate change and food production, I know that too, not kind of from the angle that David knows it from, like the temperature and atmospheric type of data, but I can definitely talk about which crops will be most affected and where they're located and why. And so we could always go into that after I present if that was a topic that you all wanted to cover. So I will now share my screen. There we go. Okay. And then I've lost my chat now. So Luann, if anybody has a clarifying question, just, ask it in the chat or interrupt me and I can define a word or,
Yeah, will do.
Whatever needs to be done. Okay, so the place I wanted to start today is really thinking about COVID-19 as a case study for other types of disruptions that might happen, because it's just been really, it's been both hard to watch everything that's going on in terms of the food supply chain and food security, but it's also been really a great learning opportunity for what we might do when infrastructure or supply chains have failure, and for how long will that failure last. So the place I like to start the story is where everyone's familiar with, because I think most of you probably experienced this, right? The fear of coronavirus really sent consumers into a grocery hoarding frenzy, and many of us went to the grocery store and found all sorts of empty shelves, and that fluctuated over the first few weeks and months of the pandemic. And continues to, right? Even now, from time to time, you'll see something missing from the shelf, and it's been really interesting to hear from the retailers. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A, or I can bring it up in the presentation about sort of the retailer experience and what's really going on behind the scenes. The other thing that I think really came up for a lot of people with this particular disruption was whether food was safe to eat. People were really worried about kind of wiping down their food when they brought it home from the grocery store, or wondering if it was okay to eat. And this was a really great article, I thought, by this journalist in Pittsburgh that was really trying to explain to us food safety, the difference between viruses and bacteria, and explaining that the COVID virus was smaller and can't really grow in food. So we've learned a lot, and now the FDA and USDA have a lot posted on the safety of our food during COVID, and it appears to be really safe. So we've learned a lot. And so, the story of this disruption on the food supply chain is really one of kind of having the different parts of the food supply variably disrupted. Now, this graphic is really kind of trying to give you a sense of the food system. And what I'm going to talk about most are those food supply chain down there in that lower left, where I put that circle that says food supply variably disrupted. And then I took each of those, the production system, storage and distribution, processing and packaging, and I popped them up. You can see those little arrows across the top because I'm going to use those as I go through my presentation. The other thing that's happened because of the way that the food supply chain itself was disrupted over time is that food prices have gone up for certain goods, but not for others. And of course, all of this together has affected what foods people have been able to access and the types of diets they've been able to consume, and then their nutrition and health outcomes. So we'll talk about some of that as we go through the presentation. So to start with, these were some of the supply side critical control points that have been really affected. You've probably seen a lot of this in the news. At the production part of the supply chain, we saw a lot of labor and surplus issues. So the labor issues were workers were also getting sick because they were either working in close quarters or in some cases living in close quarters. And so there were not opportunities to really stop and stay home during the lockdowns, right? Most of the food workers have continued to work throughout COVID. And then the second issue we've seen at the production phase has been surplus issues, right? And this is because simply that, schools were closed and institutions were closed. So all of a sudden, food producers who produced maybe food that went to businesses or went to schools could no longer provide that food to those different places. And so they had to figure out how to enter into other market channels and also repackage their food, right? Like in a particular issue in Washington State is we serve milk in these bulk containers in schools. And so when the milk could no longer go to the bulk containers, they didn't have the packaging in order to put it in a usable format that could be sold in retail. So they had to quickly come up with a way to, get more packaging. At the aggregation part of the supply chain, we also saw a lot of the labor plants were having to close due to COVID spread in those particular plants. There are just huge stories of this happening, and there's a couple of reasons why it was happening, and I'm going to show you on the next slide. But this was a big, huge choke point for COVID for a long time and continues to be these plant closures. And one of the interesting parts is that when the plants closed, something happened with the producers, which was the animals were growing too big to go through the processing supply chain, right? So suddenly you had cattle that were too big to be transported, that they weighed too much, or you had pork or chicken that had grown beyond what the automated machines could handle in terms of weight, the hanging weight on the machines, but then also some of the machines are really built to do parts of the slaughter. And so these producers had to euthanize a lot of their animals, and it was really heartbreaking to watch. And then the other thing that happened with this particular choke point that was really important was in the Midwest in particular, which is where a lot of the initial meat packing plants closed. They tried to send their animals to the coasts to be processed. And that was problematic because some of these animals they've been exposed to different viruses. And so the veterinary folks at the state level were very concerned that some of the other viruses that maybe Midwestern animals had were going to enter into Washington State and other coastal states where they didn't exist. So there were a lot of problems here at aggregation as well. And then finally with market access, right? Most of you saw this firsthand, food services were shut down, yet factories were staying open. So sometimes there was more food being processed than could could go places. And the other thing people didn't hear much about are these packaging shortages. So for a long time, you couldn't find pickles, but it wasn't because we didn't have enough cucumbers. It was because there weren't enough jars at first. And then when they finally started having enough jars, there weren't enough lids for the jars. So there were lots of sort of interesting market access problems that happened. Finally, distribution is another place where there were some disruptions happening. The deliveries and the transportation, they had to shift from delivering to restaurants and food service to deliver to supermarkets and retail. And then if you haven't heard, lately, there's just a lot of international trade disruptions in terms of initially who could enter in, cross borders and not cross borders. And then now with some of the cargo containers, right? Those shipping containers, they're getting caught in different ports. And so there's just not as many to go around. And so they're having to really focus on, where they're going to ship and whatnot. The other thing, the reason I have a picture of seafood down here too was if you entered some of the retailers, all of a sudden had seafood I had never seen before, right? This was seafood that would normally go to restaurants. It was large steak cuts, right? The salmon steaks and there were things like skate was showing up at Whole Foods. I love going around to all the different grocery stores right now and just kind of seeing what's going on. But they just had these beautiful displays of seafood that were suddenly being diverted from restaurants and food service to retail. And so I took this picture. These were some of the headlines, right, of food workers feeling isolated and fearful for their personal safety because they weren't feeling as protected maybe as they could be, because initially, right, it was really hard to get the plastic dividers that were needed and make sure everyone had masks when there were mask shortages. So, this was another part of the disruption that was going on. And then on the right side, you see those slaughterhouses, just massive outbreaks in the slaughterhouses. And it's not just because, as you can see in this picture, right, people are in close quarters to each other, right? They're nearby each other, and there's not dividers to kind of keep respiration from sort of spreading across the room. The other thing in a lot of these meat packing plants is they're often spraying the meat with a chlorinated a chlorinated kind of solution, and it was causing COVID to become airborne. So so there's a lot going on at some of these meat processing plants. This affected grocery food prices. And this is, I'm going to walk you through this graph really quick. So the purple bars are the 20-year historical average. This is Bureau for Labor Statistics data. And I don't know what happened to the citation, it got cut off. But on the y-axis, it's annual percent change. So that purple bar represents the 20-year historical average. The red is year-over-year change from October 2019 to October 2020, and the yellow is supposed to be forecast 2021. And I'm sorry, I mistyped the legend there. But you can see that certain foods, especially where the supply chain was having its biggest kind of hangups or disruptions, that's where we're seeing really, really high prices. So you can see beef and a lot of the food animal products, basically, where I have that red line underneath. We're seeing a lot of pretty radical increases in prices. And then in some of the other foods like fats and oils and cereals and bakery and fresh fruits and vegetables, we're actually seeing prices drop. So it's kind of interesting. The people sort of expected fresh fruits and vegetable prices to increase, but because we aren't exporting as much and there's so much surplus hanging around, that's one of the reasons why you don't see a greater forecast on those prices. But you can imagine, right? So here you are, a shopper. Many of you are shoppers, and as you're watching these prices go up, you're probably buying less because it's so costly to buy some of these foods, and on the prices or the foods where prices aren't changing as much. Maybe you're buying about the same amount if you can find it, right? So what really happened, behind the scenes as well is that, what we saw, the supermarkets really adapted. What many of you don't know is behind the scenes, they still continue to have shortages. And this will last probably for another 2 years or 3 years, they think, and I'll explain that one in a minute. But restaurant supply was redirected. A lot of the store label, so like, a Kroger label or a QFC label or a store label, they sourced locally instead of sourcing through their global supply chain. So many of them made lots of local connections, 15, 30 new connections in order to continue to source that food locally. And then they would just put their store brand label on it. We continue to see shortages of a lot of the shelf stable goods. And that's partially because people aren't hoarding as much now. So it was initially because of hoarding, but now what's happening is in the food banks, because of the way COVID has affected food banks and people's ability to get fresh food, the food banks are trying to buy more of the shelf stable food in order to buy for people who are reaching out to the food banks for help. And so you'll often see shortages kind of due to the rediversion of some of these foods to the food banks and whatnot. And then, obviously a lot of people have become unemployed and the unemployment rate continues to be higher than pre-COVID. So there's been greater reliance on food banks, SNAP, food assistance and whatnot. And then there's been a huge shift, obviously, to cooking at home. But, cooking healthy can really cost more, not just in money, but in time. So what we see in our data, we've been collecting data now for almost a year. We really see that at lower income categories and people who are essential workers and probably don't have as much time at home, they are not cooking more. It tends to be the higher income non-essential workers that we see this trend in. I said I would get back to the restaurant, the supply chain disruption. So, one of the things I've been on a couple of panels with retailers from PCC and General Mills and kind of a bunch of other food producers. And what they tell me is that, one of the things, because of how global our food supply chain is, as the virus, enters in and causes outbreaks in other countries, they're seeing shocks, 3 and 4 months past an outbreak. So for instance, examples that were given to me were, PCC was talking about how they were sourcing coffee beans from a country in a middle latitude, and they had a COVID outbreak, and then 4 months later that supply chain failed. But it didn't fail right as the outbreak happened, even though the plant shut down, because they still had enough in stock to continue providing PCC with that supply. It was 4 months later when the supply stock had depleted. And so they're seeing a lot of these kind of continual disruptions as outbreaks continue to occur at various times in other places. And also, if the vaccine rollout is slower in other countries that they're sourcing food from, we'll likely continue to see a lot of these disruptions. And they talk about that quite a bit. So the other part of the story, right, is, food prices aren't just going up, but incomes are going down in many cases because of unemployment, or essential workers maybe having their hours cut, or, all sorts of reasons there. And so, many of you know this part of the story, right? How bad is unemployment? It's literally off the charts, right? This was in early May of 2020. And then now up to more current date, right, we see that, while some of the temporary layoffs have, receded, the permanent job losers, that number is still higher than it was pre-COVID, and, kind of staying at about that level. This is showing kind of, in initial claims for unemployment insurance over time. And again, you can see that, it really spiked early on in the pandemic. And then you can see how it stayed high even after. So it's, you can kind of look at that pre-COVID time compared to now and see that there is just much higher unemployment. Public agencies and the federal government have really tried to offset a lot of these disruptions by really making changes to the safety nets that we have available to us. So, many of you may have heard that unemployment benefits were increased and then kept for some time, and then they disappeared, and now they're coming back. There's been a lot of uncertainty here about how those changes would stay or go and whatnot. With SNAP, which is the food stamp program or supplemental nutrition assistance program, they basically created a whole set of waivers that states could ask for to do things, for example, like sell groceries online. So you could use prior to the pandemic, you couldn't use your SNAP benefits to purchase grocery online. So during COVID, they've allowed SNAP to be used at Amazon and Walmart. And there's a reason why it's only at those two, and it's because of technology and not being able to get it through some of the other retailers just yet, although they're working on it. And then, programs like WIC, which is the Women, Infants, and Children program, they were an in-person program. They had to really quickly switch to remote services. And the other thing that was happening with WIC, so with SNAP, you can purchase pretty much any food except hot prepared food like rotisserie chickens or what you would get at the deli counter. And you also can't go to places like fast food with SNAP, but you can buy almost any type of grocery with your SNAP benefits. With WIC, there's a much more narrow list that is sort of attuned to serving women, infants, and children with their nutrient needs. And those were the exact foods that we were hoarding early on in the pandemic. So WIC really had to expand their food options kind of overnight so that, people on this program couldn't get bread, eggs, and milk. They were having a ton of trouble getting those foods to the point where retailers were holding some back, even in the back of the store, so that when WIC participants would come in, they could tell the store manager who would go in the back and get them some. So there are just so many disruptions, and all of these programs had just huge, they had huge fluctuations in how they did their work, and had to really change literally overnight. So it was a pretty big lift. So through all of this, we were really interested, and this is a survey that I've been running with Adam Drunowski and a few other folks, called the Washington State Economic Security and Food Access During COVID-19 survey. So early on, we knew we wanted to try to capture what was going on with food security. And we conducted our first wave of WA Food, is what we call it, the WA Food survey, in June to July of 2020. We got about 2,600 respondents from 38 of the 39 counties in Washington State. This was a survey on RedCap. People would go online and fill it out, and it was a convenient sample. And then we just completed wave 2, which was conducted December 2020 to January 2021. About 3,500 respondents, also 38 of 39 counties for this one as well. Wave 2 contains people who were also part of wave 1, and then they also there's also people could have cross-sectionally taken this for the first time as well. And we have wave 3 planned for this summer as well, with hopefully future waves coming, because I think some of the monitoring needs to go on for quite some time. These are a sample of our briefs. I'm going to give you just a quick snippet of kind of some of the things we've seen, but we have 7 total briefs now. So there's a lot of information, and then there's a lot of information coming out from wave 2 as well. So just really quickly, I want to talk about who the survey respondents are. The WA Food survey respondents in wave 1 and wave 2 are pretty similar. We see a diversity of ages, and mostly white, although we really tried to reach out to community organizations across the state to get greater diversity in our representation of race and ethnicity. One of our challenges was we were on a very, very, very shoestring budget, as in the PIs and many of the staff didn't make anything for doing this survey because we really wanted to do it. So we had no money for translation except to Spanish. And so that was one of our big challenges, immediately. And we're trying to change that as we continue forward into future waves. Here is the sample comparing education and household income in wave 1 and wave 2. Again, you can see that they're very similar across the waves, and we have again a diversity of different levels of education. And again, we actually have a pretty good diversity of household income in order to be able to look at stratifications here. So I'm going to talk a lot about food insecurity, and I didn't want to assume that everyone knew what food insecurity was. So I put kind of 2 common graphs on food security. Up in the right, this is the FAO version of food insecurity. And you can see that the green is kind of food security at a mild food insecurity. So this is when people have uncertainty regarding ability to obtain food. And then it gets more severe as you head over to the red. So, moderate food insecurity would entail things like compromising on food quality and variety, or having to start reducing food quantity or skipping meals. And then severe food insecurity is when a person has had to go without food. And oftentimes people consider this food insecurity with hunger. So on the left side, this is kind of the USDA way of looking at it. We have 4 major categories. There's high food security, where households have no problems or anxiety about consistently accessing adequate food. Marginal is when people are maybe starting to have some anxiety about accessing enough food, but the quality, variety, and quantity are not substantially reduced. Low food security is when households are having to reduce their quality, variety, and desirability, but maybe the quantity of food intake is not substantially disrupted. And then very low food insecurity is when all of those things are disrupted. And again, oftentimes USDA will talk about it as very low food security is food insecurity with hunger, and then low food security is just food insecure, is kind of how you'll often hear about these talked about. So just looking at categorizing those very low and low food security in wave 1 and wave 2, we see that about 30% would be considered food insecure by adding that red and the yellow slices of the pie there. This was measured using the USDA Food Security Scale 6-question version. And again, you see that it's fairly similar in wave 1 and wave 2. We have 30% in wave 1 and 27% in wave 2 were food insecure. While it's not accurate to compare this to pre-COVID, because of this being a convenience sample, pre-COVID rates for food insecurity were about 12 to 15% were considered food insecure. So you can kind of see, the increase there. Just looking at wave 1, I'm going to mostly present wave 1 and then a couple things on wave 2. We see really critical disparities in food insecurity. You can see that there are clear disparities by income, by education, by race and ethnicity, and also by marital status in the directions you would expect. Really high rates once we look at, once we stratify these, right? To see numbers like 58% or 44% or 42% is pretty shocking. We also cut the sample looking at essential and non-essential workers, because we've been hearing a lot that there were differences in food insecurity rates between the 2 types of workers. We did not see this in our sample, but we did learn a little bit about who was considered essential and non-essential, because we had people self-report this. And you can see it's not surprising, right? The essential workers are more of the food-based services, people in healthcare, or people who were doing community or social services. And the people who were non-essential and stayed home and worked were more of business, IT, finance, education. But rates were similar between the 2. We also kind of looked at food insecurity by industry because we thought it might be interesting to think about how you might, if someone wanted to target services, how you would target those industries. And you can see that the food-based services, even though many of these, some of these folks lost their job and then some were essential workers, we see high rates in food-based services and also in the consumer-facing high-contact services, things like hospitality, personal care and services, art, design, entertainment, sports, the ones that, by and large, many of them had temporary layoffs. In our wave 1, we were curious how many were affected, how many had their employment affected. We found that the vast majority of our sample received stimulus checks, but we also saw that, almost over a third was working from home. But then when you looked at kind of, adding up those who applied for unemployment, had permanent workplace closure or temporary workplace closure, it ended up being more than a third of our sample, kind of near, if you kind of add those kind of 4 middle ones up, it was like nearing half of our sample was having some sort of impact on their employment. We asked them about the shifts in their food purchasing patterns. And so you can see that people were buying less of the food animal type products, the protein products, and they were reporting buying more of the more shelf stable products. like pasta, peanut butter, bread, beans, rice, and so on, and also more of eggs. So it seemed like people were maybe trading out their protein source a little bit. We did see diet and cost concerns by income. So we stratified the sample by less than 35,000 in income a year and more than 35,000. And you can see that obviously in the lower income category that there was a lot more impact on their diet in terms of their diet quality, had worsened or was considered poor or fair. The majority of them in the lower income category reported they couldn't afford to eat balanced meals and that food was getting more expensive. When we did it by food security, so we looked at food secure by food insecure, you see the same trends, only kind of more extreme in terms of those who are food insecure really reporting that their diet quality has worsened and that they were unable to afford balanced meals and that food was getting more expensive. When we look at it from wave 1 to wave 2, so you see the diets definitely worsened during COVID, but it didn't improve either from summer to the winter of our, wave 2 samples. So the same amount of, the first set of bar graphs there is overall diet quality. So you can see that those rating their diet as poor or fair didn't really change over time. And same, those who reported that their diet worsened were the majority, and that didn't change from summer to winter. So, so we saw the food supply was variably disrupted and costs went up, but this also meant the diet quality went down. This puts people at greater COVID-19 risk if they're not eating well and they can't, live a healthy life, then their COVID-19 risk is also going to be up. So I just have a few more slides here that I wanted to share, and then I'll stop and take questions. One of the things I wanted to point out was, the trend over time is probably going to be food, higher rates of food insecurity for quite some time. And one of the things that's really hard to watch through this pandemic is that it's the households with children that have been really affected. So you see food insecurity of all households is that middle line, and then food insecurity of households with children really shot up and continues to be high. And then just if you look at just very low food security among children, so this isn't the low and very low, this is just very low, you can see that rate has really skyrocketed, and that's very, very, very concerning. So there have been a lot of attempts to create programs, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, around how to address this particular problem. The last thing I wanted to do was, a lot of people have asked me, like, well, when are things going to get back to normal? And in wave 2, we did ask this question of, what did people see as their perceived timeline for resuming regular activities? So the purple is if they're doing it now. Yellow is they think they'll be doing it in 3 to 12 months. That teal color is 1 year or more, and red is never again. Most respondents say that they're currently shopping at grocery stores in person. About half are already seeing a doctor or a dentist for non-urgent appointments. But you can see that it really drops off from there in terms of what people are currently doing and when they think they'll do it. Only a few are currently eating at a dine-in restaurant, and but about half, there 56% were saying maybe in 3 to 12 months they might be back at eating in restaurants. But you can see that that's actually pretty high for the 3 to 12 months. If you go through that yellow bar up and down, that in other activities people are not expecting it to be back to resume that regular activity in 3 to 12 months. The thing I was even really concerned about was if you look down at sending kids to school, camp, daycare, or play dates, only 10% are doing that now. 24% think that they'll be doing that in 3 to 12 months. And that was pretty shocking to take a look at. The other one that I thought was really shocking is if you look down, lower down at the travel by airplane or ride a subway or bus, you can see that there's quite a few who plan to never do that again. So it's kind of interesting to see how this has really affected people's perception of the types of activities that they're planning on resuming and when. There were some positive outcomes experienced by respondents during the COVID pandemic. And so this is wave 2 data as well. We wanted to know, like what types of positive things were going on. And people talk about they were happy they've spent more time with family. Many people report that they've had more time to cook and prepare food at home, or spend more time on hobbies or skills. Many were really appreciative of restaurants and supermarkets, making it safer for them to get food, and enjoying time outdoors and whatnot. So there were some positive outcomes that were experienced as well. I'll stop there, but I'll say that we have 7 report briefs, and we'll have more out on Wave 2 data soon. Some of these briefs are at the county level, and we hope to have a lot more at the county level coming soon. And then the last bit I'll let you know is, through doing this work, we've had a couple of communities reach out to us wanting to do targeted work to understand how their population in particular is being affected. So we have a survey that's out there working with the Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center, trying to understand how American Indian, Alaska Native tribes are being affected, how agricultural communities and farm workers are being affected. And then we are doing a lot of work with WIC to understand how staff and clients experience the change and expanded food options. So I will stop there.
And David's here.
Oh,
so
good.
We will get them out of order, but we're going to get both talks. And I think we should probably just transition to David, just in case the baby wakes up.
Sounds good.
So, yep. So you stop sharing, and we'll let David take it away, and then we'll go to Q&A after that.
Okay, so I just say screen share, right?
Yep.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We're seeing your whole desktop, but we can see, which is fine. I mean,
there's a way to do presenter mode. Let's see. I don't want to do presenter mode because I just have a laptop here, but there's a way to change. Let's see, just a second.
If you do
mirror system preferences.
If you go into it, stop sharing, David.
Okay, just a second.
And then go, and there's a little book shape down on the bottom bar of PowerPoint. It's kind of an open book shape.
Just a second.
Icon.
Yeah, just a second. It's filling my little screen, so I gotta make it smaller. Okay, I see it. Yep.
Yep. Press that.
Okay.
And then share
okay.
screen, and you can share that screen, and you should be able to.
Okay, great. Wow, cool. Okay, now can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Leave it there. We're still seeing your whole screen, but it's fine. Just leave it there and you're good. Go ahead.
How do I do, like, is it fill in the screen?
Yep, it's good.
Okay,
it's good.
All right.
We're seeing what you're...
All right, good. So I just talked briefly about the basic effects of climate change on food production globally. And I'm going to focus on grains because that's where most of the calories come from. Jennifer just told you a lot about nutrition and how important it is. But I'm just going to talk about the fuel, that is the calories. So we'll talk a little bit about crop yield and how heat affects crop yields, because that's the main thing we know for sure with climate change is it's going to warm. We'll talk about how that affects the yield, the mean yield, and the variability in yield, and how it affects the pest pressure, the loss of crops due to pests. Then we'll sum up by talking about overall food security in terms of the production side. So motivation, crop yield, heat, and climate change. By 2050, the global demand of grain is projected to increase by 2% per year. So that's the demand side. It's expected to double by 2050 due to economic development as people shift towards more meat diets, and population increases from 7.5 to 9.5 billion. The supply of cereals is increasing at a rate of 0.5% to 1% per year, and it's been declining for 3 decades now. And if you take 30 years out, 1.01 times 20 to the 29th, you end up with a 33% increase by 2050, which is a long way from doubling. So we're going to more and more into shortages of grain supply for calories. There are other changing factors that affect food production. All the soil that's good for producing grain is being used right now. And actually the amount of soil that's actually considered good cropland is being lost at 1% a year due to wind erosion or water erosion. Or salting up of the soil due to irrigation practices. There's obviously water stress and groundwater is being depleted for irrigation in many places in unsustainable ways. And then climate change, of course, will have an increasing drag on all this through heat. So Precipitation does matter for crops. If you grew up in the mid-latitudes like I did, you think precipitation is the whole answer, but for most of the people on the planet, it's not precipitation at all, it's heat. And I'll show you some data that confirm that. Projections show that decreased average precipitation in the subtropics, and little change anywhere else. At least there are such large uncertainties that it's not worth talking about precipitation changes unless you're in the subtropics where models consistently show drying compared to today, that is less rainfall. Increased CO2. CO2 is a food for plants. There's a lot of experiments out there, both in terms of these FACE in-field experiments and international research centers that are showing that doubling CO2 does very little for grain yields. In fact, it's less than 10% increase in a doubling of CO2 in a real world situation. Temperature, so heat stress on plants. You have two things going on with temperature. One is just the heat stress, and two is the decrease in soil moisture, which is a little bit less certain than the heat stress itself. It already matters in the tropics, and it'll become increasingly important in the breadbasket countries of the world. Most of the grains in the world are produced in these four countries: US, China, France, and Ukraine. And they're the places where right now temperature is not so important, but it will be very, very soon. Okay, and I'll show you why that's the case. So if you, let's see. Can you see this whole slide here? Let me move this. Can you guys see this whole slide, the whole chart? Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is measured in a research plot in Northwest Mexico. It's the home of the Green Revolution for wheat, where the yields of wheat tripled due to increased better varieties, irrigation, and fertilizer back in the 60s and 70s. And this is just a plot each year of how much yield you get per hectare, how many tons per hectare you get as a function of the temperature. And
Actually,
you can see,
David, all we're seeing is a blank plot.
Yep, that's right. Here comes the data, hopefully.
Right.
Actually, where is it? There it is. So each dot is for a year. And you can see basically as the temperature goes up, yield goes down. And the relationship here is 10% per year. This is in a field that's got plenty of moisture, it's irrigated, it's got way too much fertilizer, and it's got way too much pesticide. So this is the only limiting thing here is temperature. So this is measured in a controlled environment in Mexico, 10% decrease per 1 degree C increase. You do the same thing in India and you get a 15% decrease in wheat yield for every degree you go up. And in rice in the Philippines, it's 17% for every degree C. And these are places where water is not limiting, fertilizer is not limiting, and pesticides in abundant supply. Okay, so why is this the case? There's a whole bunch of physiological effects that affect yield. One is the spikelets, where all the grain is at the end, are less fertile, so they grow out less frequently when you're under higher temperature. There's also grain filling. Most of the grain actually comes in at the very end of the plot. And if it's hot, basically the plant stops growing earlier. And so there's less grain per kilogram, basically, of plant. There's increased water stress, of course. When you have warmer conditions, you have increased evapotranspiration, and you also have increased respiration. Respiration increases as temperature goes up. And in this particular case, it's increased respiration, which is doing the damage. This is especially important for all crops, but especially for wheat, rice, and soybeans and maize. Now, I guess I can't, I have a thing at the bottom here, so I can't see the very bottom of the slide, but maybe you guys can. Okay, let's see what happened here. Just a second. Okay, so what's going on here? So every living organism has an optimal temperature. Typically for plants, it looks like this, that the yield actually is some optimal here at about 26, 27 degrees Celsius. This would be like the average growing season temperature. And as it gets warmer than that, the yield drops off very quickly. Let me see if I can pointer options here, laser pointer. The yield drops off really quickly as you increase temperature. And of course, if it gets really cold, it's also, yield is not good. So what happens here today in the tropics is the temperatures are out here on average in the growing season. So already you're beyond the optimal yields. And so the yields are actually already low in the tropics due to heat stress. If you live in the mid-latitudes, where most of the major grains are grown in really wide supplies and traded all over the world and used for food security, we're actually at the optimal temperature. So if you're growing grain in, say, the Midwest US, Ukraine, Europe, you actually don't pay much attention to temperature because you're right at the optimal. And if you wander too far left or right here, just a cold summer or warm summer, you don't change the yield very much. So you care about precipitation. Okay, so in the future, of course, we're going to be moving the mid-latitudes over here, warmer conditions. So we're going to actually be below the optimal yield, and that's why the mean yield will go down in the mid-latitudes. Okay, so at the end of this century, we're way out of bounds. Every place that's red here are places where the odds are greater than 90% that at the end of this century we'll be experiencing temperatures that we've never seen before in human civilization. And remember these numbers, for every degree C increase you get, you're looking at a 10% to 15% to 17% reduction in yields. And these are under optimal, otherwise optimal conditions, optimal water, fertilizer, and pesticides. Okay, so my mouse, there we go. So here are maps of mean changes of maize, for example, which is really probably the most important grain. And you can see here, this is the maize yield change due to 2-degree warming on the left and a 4-degree warming on the right. And you've seen about 20% reduction everywhere. It depends on where you are, but it's roughly 20% reduction for a 2-degree C change. And that's expected at 2055. This is 2-degree C relative to the end of the last century, so the year 2000. And a 4-degree C global warming will give us more like a 30 to 40% loss pretty much everywhere in maize. Okay, so these people, other people have found these results before. These are consistent with their numbers. So the other thing, which is probably even more worrisome than the change in the mean yield, is a change in the yield variability. So let's go back to this plot here, and let's put ourselves in the mid-latitudes. Today, we're right here at the optimal. A very cold summer will be out here, not much of a change in the yield. You're still close to the optimal. A warm summer out here. But as so there's the range today. It's only about a 10% change due to temperature variability. But if I shift now out here, so this is my new mean temperature because of warming. I have the same weather moving back and forth here. Just a second, I got a cat in front of me. Then you can see what's going to happen here. If I have an unusually warm summer, just due to the same weather on top of an overall mean warmer climate, I end up with no yield. But if I have a extreme cold summer in the future, I can end up with a perfect yield, just like I have today, an optimal yield. So the volatility, even if the weather volatility doesn't change at all, the volatility in grain yield will increase dramatically. Okay, so this is filling out the chart. So a measure of how variable a yield is today is measured by the coefficient of variation. It's a measure of the standard deviation divided by the mean. Think of it as, what's the typical deviation you get from your average yield today? What's a typical bad year or a good year? So coefficient of variation tells you, if it's 0.2 or 20%, it means, a bad year will be 20% below normal. If it's a good year, it'll be 20% above normal. And you can see today the coefficient of variation for maize is about 20.2. It's about 20%. So a bad year would be 20% below normal. A good year would be 20% above normal. And then of that 20% variability, half of it today is driven by temperature and precipitation. The other half of it's driven by things like pests and other things that that are hard to control for, or changes in varieties, for example. Okay, so what happens when you go out into the future? This is the ratio of the coefficient of variability with a 2-degree increase compared to today. So this is how this variability changes in time. You can see these numbers here are on the order of 50%. So in other words, the volatility in crops in growing grain will go up by about 50% with just a 2-degree C increase. And if you go to 4-degree C increase, you look at it at a factor of over 2. So the variability in yield will increase by 2-fold, basically, with a 2-degree C increase, and a 4-fold with a 4-degree warmer world, up to 4-fold. Okay, so let's look at some plots to put that into some real terms here. So they can show you graphs of what's the likelihood of having a yield today of maize in different countries. And then I'll show it with the same curve, the likelihood, with a 2-degree warming, and the same curve with a 4-degree warming. So 2-degree warming is expected at about 2055, 4 degrees expected at 2080 or 2090. So this is for Argentina, and 0 would be the mean yield today, which is 7.8 tons. And a really good year might be 10% more than that, and a really bad year might be 10% less. as I go to a 2-degree warmer world, I get a 10% on average reduction in Argentina. But you can see the volatility, the width here gets wider. And as I go to a 4-degree warmer world, the yield drops again to 30% below today on average. But the volatility gets bigger. These curves are getting wider, right? And let me show you the other. So each one of these curves is for the top 6 maize producing and exporting countries in the world. So most of the maize in the world is produced and exported by these 6 countries. And you can see some of the countries like France, for example. Today, there's absolutely no variability in maize yield in France. But as you go to 2-degree warmer world, then 4-degree warmer world, basically it's a crapshoot. On average, yeah, it's 20% below normal in France, but it could be 0, and it could be, there's a slight chance it could look like a mean yield today. So the volatility in yield from one country, in any one country, as you go out even to 2050, becomes really large. So extremely large yield losses are increasingly likely. So this is where the implications for global food security comes in. Synchronous temperature-induced production shocks in large exporting and large importing countries, which have never been experienced in the last 50 years. There's never been two of those countries that have had bad years in the same year. And these will become really common as you go into the future because of the variability in weather on top of a mean warming. And that will cause prices to become extremely volatile on international markets. And that's simply because maize is really highly traded crop. And there's other things that when maize becomes dear, there's other things that are substitute for maize. So when maize becomes expensive, the things that replace it also become expensive, typically wheat. Okay, so for maize, the price volatility in international markets extends to domestic markets as well. So basically, if a country has a really bad year and the prices go up, other countries' prices will go up as well. I think I got to stop because the baby's crying. So you got volatility, you have increased pest pressure, and let me just go to the end here. And I'm sorry, I can tape this and make it available to people. So there's increased pest pressure. So you have decreased mean yield, increased variability in yield. This means like a 30% reduction in India, 40%, increased volatility, increased loss due to pest pressure, which I couldn't show you, loss of groundwater for growing crops, and loss of snow in, for example, the west coast of the US for irrigation. And I'm gonna have to stop because the baby's crying. Decreased in nutritional content. I think probably Jennifer said something about climate change and nutritional content, maybe not, but I guess the protein content of grains goes down when you grow them under higher temperatures. So okay. Increased use. So I got to stop because the baby's crying. Okay, sorry.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Good. So now I think what we're going to do is transition to Q&A during this crazy time. I think I'll kind of keep everyone here and let's have a conversation. So you can, I believe that you can unmute yourself, raise your hand or put something in chat for a question or a comment. Becky has a question. Go ahead, Becky. Can you unmute? Yes, good.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so thanks, Jennifer, for a great talk. I'm wondering fundamentally why it costs more to eat healthy. Is there like one fundamental reason for that, or is it complicated?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's complicated, right? But generally speaking, the more nutrient dense foods other than fruits and vegetables tend to cost more, right? I mean, that was the trend before COVID, is that a healthier diet was, the food affordability is much higher for a healthier diet than a more nutrient poor diet. The more shelf stable foods tend to be a little bit cheaper. A lot of people think it's because of subsidies, but it's not. It's a much more complicated story than that, actually. Michael Pollan always likes to sell it as subsidies, the direct payments to farmers, but those have actually been gone since the 2014 Farm Bill. We haven't had direct payments for farmers since then. So if that had been the cause, then our food prices would have already had quite a shift. Yeah, it's a lot. Like, I feel like it's like a really long story in my mind. I don't have like a quick answer.
So it sounds like one of the answers might be just how long it can sit on the shelf. If it can sit on the shelf for longer, it's cheaper.
Um,
Uh,
that can tend to be,
Harder?
yeah,